It is the most important spot on the Jets defense. Robert Saleh believes in building a strong unit in the trenches. And today we're going to take a look at the defensive line talent the Jets have on the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Tuesday, August 16th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or your first watch every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button. You'll never miss an episode. And if you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps the channel out, and it helps other Jets fans find the podcast. A little programming note, if you'd like to hear what I have to say about teams other than the Jets, I'm the co-host of Locked On NFL today, so you can find that episode in your feed. Luke, Braun, and I discuss some quarterback battles for the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Carolina Panthers, and the Seattle Seahawks, so be sure to check that out if you'd like to hear my non-Jets thoughts. But today we're going to talk about the Jets' defensive line. We know that Robert Saleh really believes in building up the defensive line. And it's not to say defensive line is the only important position. The Jets have obviously prioritized other positions this offseason, most notably corner on the defensive side of the ball. But I think we know that Robert Saleh thinks defensive line is the most important spot. And that's based on the way the Jets have prioritized the position since he took over as head coach. Last offseason, there was a big push. They bring in Carl Lawson. They bring in Sheldon Rankins. They bring in even Vinnie Curry, who did not play last year. And there were a couple more moves this offseason, guys like Jacob Martin. Of course, the Jets draft Jermaine Johnson. This is a defense that has a lot of key roles, but I think none's more important than the defensive line. I think the way the Jets have addressed this shows that they believe that it's the toughest position. It's the biggest commodity there is, at least as far as the scheme that they run. And as far as I can tell, there are kind of like three different roles on the defensive line the Jets have. I think there's one role where you have a guy who's a defensive end, and he's kind of just a pure pass rusher. And that's the role I think Carl Lawson was signed to play last year, because when I was watching the Jets defensively, it seemed like the other defensive linemen had run responsibilities, and I think that's the reason you saw John Franklin Myers play a lot of defensive end, even though Jets ran a lot of four-man lines. And typically in a four-man line, a guy like a John Franklin Myers would be a defensive tackle. He'd play inside more. He really would only play defensive end in a three-man line, kind of like a classic 3-4 defense. But they did things a little bit differently because I think they wanted, especially going a little bit smaller, trying to get faster at the linebacker position. It all fits together. Last year, C.J. Mosley came in dropping some weight to play faster. The Jets were looking at bringing in safeties, guys who played safety in college, and converting them to linebacker. They wanted to get fast at the linebacker position. So I think to protect those guys, they wanted to get a little bit bigger on the defensive line. So a lot of these guys were focused more on the run, and you wanted one guy off the edge who could get to the quarterback. I think that was supposed to be Carl Lawson, and then he got hurt. And I really wonder how much that changed the Jets' defense last year, especially on third downs, because on obvious passing downs, the Jets were blitzing a lot, and I wonder if Lawson was there, maybe that would change things, because he was like the one pure pass rusher the Jets were going to have last year, and he obviously didn't play, so the Jets blitzed a lot more on third downs. But I think that there's one role where your job is to get after the quarterback. Then there's another role where I view it as kind of like a hybrid defensive end, defensive tackle type job. It was the job Franklin Myers had last year. Yes, your job is to collapse the pocket, and John Franklin Myers did that pretty well. There were some inconsistent moments for JFM last year, but all in all, I think it was a pretty good season he had, and he obviously earned an extension at one point during the season. The Jets have a couple guys to play that role, and then these guys slide inside, use their strength a little bit more, use their quickness a little bit more on the inside on passing downs. And then the third role I see is defensive tackle, which are guys who are playing inside, they're dealing with things in traffic. What was interesting is that I don't know that the Jets really used, and this is me doing some reverse engineering based on what I saw on film. This is nothing the Jets have publicized at all. But I view this defensive tackle, I don't think that they necessarily differentiate between a pure nose tackle and more of an under tackle the way other teams do. A lot of teams just have one guy whose job is to eat up blocks, and the other guy's their job is to penetrate, get up the field. They have those roles, but I don't think they differentiate which player handles which role. Some teams just have a pure nose tackle whose job is to eat up blocks. The other tackle's job is to get up the field. I think it's a little bit different for the Jets. I think it just depends on where everybody lines up. You could have the role where your job is to eat up blocks, or you could have the role where your job is to get up field. And it just depends on where the other team lines up. Jets run a lot of what's known as an over front, which essentially means that the guy who's playing on the ball, the guy who's the nose tackle, the guy who plays the nose tackle role on a given play. Again, they don't designate which this guy specifically a nose tackle. Like Steve McClendon was specifically a nose tackle for the Jets. On the Jets defense, on the current Jets defense, you could be a nose tackle depending on where the ball is lined up, or you could be the guy who tries to penetrate. But the Jets run a lot of what's known as an over front, which essentially means that the guy who's the penetrator lines up at the 3 technique, which is on the outside shoulder of the guard, on the side where the tight end is. So that's a lot of stuff you probably don't need, but that's the way I think the Jets defense runs, and I think that helps to explain why the Jets have the roles that they do on defense. Now, Carl Lawson is back this year. I think Carl Lawson is going to play a key role for this defense, and maybe he's a guy who can help them blitz a little bit less on third downs. Although with the additions of Sauce Gardner and DJ Reed, maybe they'll want to blitz a little bit more, because if you feel confident in your corners, it frees a lot. It opens up a lot of different play calls, and there's kind of a contrast. Do you want to blitz a lot, or do you want to trust your front four? Because on the one hand, if you trust your front four to get home, you don't necessarily need to blitz a whole lot if you got guys who are really talented. On the other hand, if you have a talented front four, blitzing can make them even better, because the more guys you send at the quarterback, the less blockers there are. So that means you get a lot of one-on-ones. You may be able to double team a Carl Lawson otherwise if you don't blitz, but if you send an extra blitzer, the guy who was going to double team Lawson has to pick up the blitzer. So it's going to be interesting to see how it goes, but I think Carl Lawson is kind of like the top guy in the pass rushing role I described. I think another guy who's going to fit that role is Jacob Martin this year. Jacob Martin was actually a full-time player last year for Houston. Guy had an interesting career, actually began his career with the Seattle Seahawks and was kind of a throw-in in the Jadeveon Clowney trade, and ended up developing into a pretty solid player. I think he's going to have more of a part-time role this year for the Jets, but the Jets gave him a decent contract, and he's a guy who you'll see him step on the field, I think, on third downs. I think that's kind of the spot you'll see him. I don't know that he's going to be a full-time player. Maybe he's a little bit of lost in insurance, because last year, of course, Carl Lawson went down, and the Jets didn't really have anybody to replace him. They had to trade for another Lawson. They had to trade for Shaq Lawson, who ended up actually playing the run pretty well, but was not that guy who could get after the quarterback the way the Jets wanted. And, of course, when I talk about these guys who are in the pure pass-rushing role, Jets still want them to play the run. It's just not their full-time job. Another guy who I think could conceivably fit that role, a guy who could play on passing downs, is Vinnie Curry, who the Jets brought in last year. He had the rare blood disorder, so had to miss the full season. The guy is 34, clearly near the end of his career. In fact, you would think this is probably going to be Vinnie Curry's final season in the NFL if he's able to make the team. I think part of the reason Vinnie Curry was brought back this year was the Jets were so young last year. I think they wanted to make a point of bringing in some veteran guys this year, and part of it's the system. You need guys who understand the system. And Vinnie Curry was, even though he didn't play last year, he did get some experience in the Saleh system. You saw all the breakdown. All 3 levels of the defense had breakdowns last year. So maybe some veteran guys, and you saw this with some other guys. I think Quan Alexander can help on this front. But I think Vinnie Curry, as much as anything, is brought back for veteran leadership. And I think part of it is you saw last year the Jets kind of came unglued at points, and I think that they want some stabilizing presences on the sidelines during games, especially when they had so many bad starts in the first quarter, and I wonder whether a more mature team could have handled some of those bad starts a little bit better. So I think that's where Vinnie Curry's in the mix. Now, Vinnie Curry's pretty big for a defensive end. He's pushing 280, but I think at this stage of his career, he's going to be a rotational guy. You're not going to put a 34-year-old out there to see extensive playing time. So I view Vinnie Curry as a guy who's, maybe if he plays, it could be in like situational role. It could be in a spot where you're trying to get a good snap out of him on a passing down. And then another guy who I think the last guy I'd say could fit this role would be Bryce Huff, who was the non-drafted signing a couple years ago out of Memphis. And really, I don't know that Bryce Huff is like a starting level player in this league, but he's kind of carved out a role for himself as a situational pass rusher. He's done okay. If Bryce Huff's your best pass rusher, you're doomed as a defense. But if he's like your fourth best guy, fifth best guy, he's not bad. He can occasionally get to the quarterback. So these are the guys I view as having that role. But there are some other roles on this Jets defense. And as we continue on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to talk about what the Jets have at the defensive tackle position, including a player who's obviously really important. That's Quinnen Williams, entering a big year for his development. That's as we continue on this Tuesday episode. Of course, the Jets had a lot of injuries last year. We're hoping they'll have better health this year. And I want to tell you about our next partner, Athletic Greens One. It's a product that can help with your health. With one delicious scoop of Athletic Greens One, you're absorbing 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, whole food-sourced superfoods, probiotics, and adaptogens to help you start your day right. This special blend of ingredients supports your gut health, your nervous system, your immune system, your energy, recovery, focus, and aging. All the things. It supports better sleep quality and recovery. It supports mental clarity and alertness. It's the one thing with the best things. Athletic Greens uses the best of the best products based on science, with constant product iterations and third-party testing, and it costs you less than $3 a day. You're investing in your health, and it's cheaper than your cold brew habit. And to make it easy, Athletic Greens is going to give you a free 1-year supply of immune-supporting vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. All you have to do is visit athleticgreens.com/NFL Network. Again, that is athleticgreens.com/NFL Network to take ownership over your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listen or your first watch every day. We are free and available on all platforms. Today we're talking Jets defensive line. And as I mentioned in the first segment, when it comes to the defensive tackle position, I don't know that the Jets differentiate between a pure nose tackle and a guy who's maybe a 3 technique, a guy who tries to get up the field. I think they put all of their guys in both roles depending on where the ball is. You may be the nose tackle, you may be the guy who gets up the field, but it's not a situation where like Steve McClendon or Foley Fatukasi where you are the nose tackle. Every single play you're just eating up blocks. Depends on where you are. And that's the type of thing that could cut down on your production as a player. And I think about Quinnen Williams. I think about people talking about Quinnen Williams. I've seen 10 sack projections. I don't know that's really fair because outside of Aaron Donald, maybe Chris Jones, there aren't a lot of defensive tackles who are putting up double-digit sacks on a consistent basis. I mean, you can look at Fletcher Cox's career. A guy who just went into the Hall of Fame, Richard Seymour, who was maybe more of a defensive end in the 3-4 for much of his career, but he was never a big sack guy. And I don't think the Jets need Quinnen Williams to be a huge sack guy. When you're playing the defensive tackle position, more often than not, winning just means doing things that don't really show up in the stat sheet. It means you winning at your assignments. It means eating up blocks. It means redirecting ball carriers. It means holding the point of attack. I think the Jets need more out of Quinnen Williams this year, though. I think last year he kind of took a step back. Quinnen Williams was not a bad player last year, and he certainly was not the problem on defense, but he was not as good as he was in 2020. And I think his run defense took a step back last year. It was a contributing factor to the Jets' struggles. It was not the factor in the Jets' struggles against the run, but there were a lot of plays where the Jets lost up front, and maybe Quinnen Williams wasn't quite getting the push he did a year ago. So clearly the Jets are going to look for Quinnen Williams to do more. Outside of that, though, this defensive tackle position, it's got a lot of question marks. You got Sheldon Rankins returning. Rankins was signed by the Saints last year. I have to admit, I was really excited about the signing. I thought he and Williams could be a great duo together. Rankins did have his moments as a pass rusher. I remember there was one play against the Tennessee Titans in overtime, and he collapsed the pocket. He forced a bad throw because he got into Ryan Tannehill's face, and that forced the Titans to settle for a field goal attempt that they missed and clinched the Jets' first win of the season. But those moments were fleeting, and Rankins was a big problem against the run. If we're ranking the biggest issues the Jets had against the run, Rankins is probably up there. And then after that, I mean, you've got Nathan Shepard, who is Nathan Shepard. He's been a rotational player through much of his career. Now, he had all of those awful penalties last year. There have been some moments where Nathan Shepard has looked like a guy who could handle a rotation. I remember during his second season the second half of that year, he had some very good games. He had some really quality snaps, but this guy's been very up and down through his career. He's not shown any consistency. And you have to remember that when the Jets drafted him, he was already pretty old, and now he's at 28 years of age. So to the extent the player is going to develop, by the time he's 28, he's probably already developed. So I don't really know what more you're getting out of Nathan Shepard. An interesting guy, I think, is Jonathan Marshall, who the Jets drafted late rounds last year out of Arkansas. Actually had a good preseason last year, and a guy who had some amazing athletic test scores for a guy his size. And I think the Jets had hopes for him. I think the Jets do have hopes for him. And there's every opportunity for Jonathan Marshall to carve out a role for him on this team if he impresses people, if he impresses the coaching staff during this camp and during this preseason period, because the Jets don't really have a whole lot of guys who are just natural defensive tackles. It's really, the Jets are really pretty stacked at the defensive end position, but they don't have guys who are pure defensive tackles. But I do think the Jets have this role on their defense that's kind of like a hybrid. It's a little bit defensive end, a little bit defensive tackle. I discussed it a little bit earlier when I talked about maybe the power end position, a guy whose primary responsibility on a lot of plays is going to be to play the run, but also you're looking for him to collapse the pocket a secondary way. And we're going to talk about those players as we close out this Tuesday episode of Locked On Jets. Of course, today we're talking about players who are going to shut down fantasy running backs, fantasy receivers, fantasy quarterbacks, fantasy tight ends. It's almost the start of the NFL season, and I love this time of year. If you're into sports betting or fantasy, you'll need a competitive edge to win. And that's why I recommend the Elias Game Plan app. It's the ultimate sports betting and fantasy companion for the NFL, NBA, and Major League Baseball. Elias Game Plan is the only sports app from the most trusted name in sports stats, Elias Sports Bureau, the official statisticians of U.S. pro sports leagues, including the NFL. Their app allows you to access team and player stats, head-to-head team comparisons, and Elias insights from the Elias Sports Bureau's research team. The app is your one-stop source for player news and league-validated player stats and team records, expert analysis for betting, building your fantasy team, impressing friends. Perfect for the preseason. You get player previews to help you draft a winning fantasy team, and team previews so you know what to expect as the regular season kicks off as well. Elias is the most respected fantasy research team in the industry. Quality information is key, so I'm glad they created this app for accurate data and important context. Take my advice. Download the Elias Game Plan app today. With new features available all the time, take your game to the next level. The NFL season's right around the corner, so don't wait. Find the Elias Game Plan in the App Store or Play Store today. Of course, the NFL season is right around the corner, and what better way to enjoy a Jets game than by turning on the TV and indulging in some delicious Built Bars. If you have not tried Built Bar Puffs yet, you are depriving yourself of one of life's greatest joys. And guess what? There's a new flavor. It's delicious, indulgent cookie dough covered in chocolate. That's right, Built has done it again. Cookie dough chunk puffs have a light and chewy texture, real cookie dough chunks, and of course they're covered in 100% real chocolate, just like all other Built bars. These are delicious. If you're a cookie dough fan, I love cookie dough ice cream. These taste just like it. If you run to Built.com to snag a box for you and your family, it's the perfect treat, or you can find a really good hiding place and just hoard them for yourselves. I won't tell you. I won't tell. Like all Built bars, the cookie dough chunk puffs is covered in 100% real chocolate. That means they're healthy and tasty. Chocolate-covered cookie dough with a light, fluffy texture. It's so good. You're going to absolutely love it. I've tried it. It's really, really good. Go to Built.com and use promo code LOCKEDON15. If you do that, you get 15% off your order. Again, it's promo LOCKEDON15. That's LOCKEDON, number 1, number 5, for 15% off at BuiltBuilt.com. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday. We're talking Jets defensive line today. So I've talked about guys who I think have kind of a pure pass rushing role for this team. I've talked about defensive tackles. But in the Robert Saleh defense, it seems to me that there's kind of a hybrid role. I think Saleh likes versatility. We know Saleh likes to rotate guys in and out. And there are some players who are kind of defensive ends, but also kind of defensive tackles. And depending on the down, depending on who needs a rest, depending on whether you're expecting a run or a pass, on early downs, you want to protect those linebackers because the Jets are a little bit small at the linebacker position. So these guys are a little bit bigger for defensive ends, so they'll play there, play with some power, eat up blocks. But on passing downs, maybe they're quick enough to overwhelm interior type linemen. I think John Franklin Myers is kind of the template for this. Franklin Myers, I gotta be honest, I was surprised last year when the Jets played him at defensive end so early in the season, but as the season went on, I kind of got why they did it. And John Franklin Myers had some excellent games and earned himself a new contract last year, so tough to complain about it. There were some stretches in the middle of the season where maybe he didn't do a whole lot, but I think he's kind of like the template for what the Jets want. The bigger guy who's gonna be able to eat up blocks, but also collapse the pocket. Guy who can do a little bit of everything. In fact, I'll give you a guy, Michael Clemons, who obviously had a big preseason game against the Eagles. Now, part of this is he's 25 and he's going up against guys who are younger than him. That's part of the reason I think he had success last year at Texas A&M. But I thought Michael Clemons actually played well in the handful of first team snaps he got as well. And this was the pick I disliked the most at the time. It was the one pick I questioned, but once it was revealed that the Jets were looking for Clemons to fill this role, the pick made so much more sense to me because suddenly I see it because this is a guy with power. He's a little bit bigger. I mean, I don't think he's super twitchy. He's not, he doesn't have like the explosion off the edge, but a guy who uses his hands well, who can push the pocket, and you slide him inside on passing down. Suddenly that makes sense to me. And suddenly we saw him have success in that role against Philadelphia. And I think that maybe they're kind of trying to develop Clemons into being that sort of hybrid type player. Another guy who I think fits this role is Solomon Thomas. Speaking of players, veterans the Jets brought in who understand the system, who maybe they're looking to help on the coaching side of, kind of be I don't know if coach on the field is the right word, but a guy I think the Jets are looking to for some degree of scheme knowledge, kind of help impart his wisdom on this young roster. I think that's the reason they brought in Solomon Thomas. Now, Solomon Thomas has been a disappointment, but through his career, he was a top 3 pick. You have to remember San Francisco. This was the pick back in 2017. San Francisco had the second pick. Chicago traded up from 3 to 2. Chicago traded up one spot to take Mitchell Trubisky, passing over Patrick Mahomes on the way to doing that. San Francisco was sitting at 3. They needed a quarterback, and they passed on Mahomes as well. And they drafted Solomon Thomas instead. You would have to think Saleh, as the new defensive coordinator, had a role in that. And even though Solomon Thomas did not develop well, I think it does speak volumes, the fact that Jets gave Solomon Thomas for relative to his production, maybe it wasn't a big contract in general, but relative to Solomon Thomas's production to this point in his career, it was a fairly lucrative contract. And even though Solomon Thomas never really developed the way Saleh was hoping for, I think that in that role, I think he kind of used him as the template for that role along with John Franklin Myers. So I don't love Solomon Thomas, to be honest with you. This was not a signing I was crazy about, but I think that's the rationale for it. I think he's kind of another guy who's kind of plays that kind of hybrid role, guy the Jets think can maybe take some of the younger players under his wing, show them the intricacies of the system, what Sal is looking for, the techniques he wants them to use. And I think that that's Solomon Thomas's role on this team. And of course, speaking of first round picks, you have to talk about Jermaine Johnson. It's amazing we've gotten to this point in the episode without talking about the guy the Jets traded up for in the first round. Now, I don't know that he's a guy who's going to slide in all that much to the tackle position, but I think part of the reason the Jets drafted him is he was a complete player. Coming out of college, he showed an ability to stop the run. He also showed an ability to get to the quarterback. If you're looking for somebody in that role who does a little bit of both, I think Jermaine Johnson could fit it well. Again, I don't know if he's a guy who's going to slide inside like JFM or Michael Clemons, but a well-rounded player who I think fills out the Jets' defensive line well and fits what they want. And then there's also a guy who I think the Jets have kind of given up on, but did have a good game, Jabari Zaniga, who I'm not really sure which of the roles the Jets would have him play, whether he'd be more the conventional pass rushing end that I discussed, or whether he'd fit more the hybrid role, a little bit of both maybe. I feel like Zaniga is probably heading for the practice squad because the Jets have so much talent on this defensive line. There are lots of decent. I mean, there may not be a great player on this defensive line, but there are lots of really solid players on this defensive line. So Zaniga may have a tough time finding a role on this unit, but a guy who did play pretty well in preseason and the preseason opener and has gotten off to a good start this year in training camp. Reportedly, he's playing really well in camp, so maybe he's going to make decisions tough for the Jets. And I mean, the one thing you can say for the Jets is they're going to have some depth this year on the defensive line. And maybe not that like all pro type star level player, but lots of good players, a couple very good players. And there may be some guys who make it to the practice squad who can be called upon and actually might be able to produce for this team. And it's not a surprise because that's the Robert Saleh focus, I think. I think Robert Saleh wants wants a lot of depth on the defensive line because it's so important for his system. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. If you enjoy the show, hit that subscribe button. You'll never miss an episode. Please give this show a 5-star review if you're listening on Podcast Source, or a big thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. Again, if you want more of me today, I am the co-host of Locked On NFL, so you can head over to the Locked On NFL feed, hear me talk about the quarterback battles for the Seattle Seahawks, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and the Carolina Panthers. We'll talk about some old friends from the Jets in some of these competitions. But until then, until tomorrow, have a great day, everybody.